At 24, Alara had already lost her grandfather, which was the world, her inheritance, which was next to nothing, and her place in a town that had never quite made room for her. All her family, a word that had shrunk to a single sour uncle, left her was the right to show up at a town auction for a collapsing schoolhouse, a building so rotten with damp and neglect that the council sold it for $12. And the developer who wanted the land for its location and not its memory laughed right in her face when she won. But what nobody knew, what the developer in his clean suit and the councilman in his weary resignation and the uncle in his quiet shame could not possibly imagine, was what her grandfather, the school's last and only janitor, had sealed behind the gymnasium wall 30 years before. That, though, comes later. For now, there was only the girl, the deed that cost less than a bag of groceries, and a single, worn wooden block she kept in her pocket, a scrap from his workshop, smooth with the memory of his hands and bearing a strange, deliberate notch that seemed to be waiting for a lock no one else could see. The laughter of the developer echoed longer than the slam of the gavel, a sharp, metallic sound that promised demolition and forgetting. But Alara held the deed, its paper thin and dry as a dead leaf, and felt not the humiliation of the price, but the anchor of it. $12 was not an insult. It was a beginning. First, there was the quiet of the house after he was gone. A silence that was not empty, but heavy, weighted with the things he had not said, the routines he no longer kept, the coffee pot that stayed cold in the morning, the scent of sawdust that was finally fading from the air, a ghost giving up its haunt. Her grandfather had been a man of few words and many textures. The grain of wood, the grit of sharpening stone, the soft flannel of his shirts. He had moved through the world with a slow, deliberate rhythm. A man who measured twice and spoke once, if at all. The funeral was a sparse affair. A handful of older townsfolk who remembered him as the man who fixed their screen doors for a smile and a cup of coffee, and her uncle, who stood with his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the wind in some deeper, colder draft of obligation. He had handled the estate, a word far too grand for the contents of the small rented house. There was a truck with more rust than paint, a set of tools worn into the shape of her grandfather's hands, and a savings account that would barely cover the cost of the funeral itself. He wasn't much for planning, her uncle had said, not unkindly, but with the weary finality of a man closing a ledger. He just was, and that was the truth of it. He had been a presence, a constant, like the old oak at the edge of town, and no one had ever thought to ask if his roots were deep or his branches were strong until he was gone. Will was read in a stuffy lawyer's office that smelled of paper and disappointment. It was a simple document, leaving the truck and tools to her, the meager savings to her uncle to settle his affairs, and a final, curious clause. It mentioned the old schoolhouse on Miller's Ridge, the one that had been shuttered for decades, a brick and timber ghost overlooking the town. It granted her, his only granddaughter, his blessing to take an interest in the place, should it ever become available. It was a wish, not an inheritance, a sentence of sentiment in a document of sums. Her uncle had sighed, a long, slow exhalation of impatience. "Alara, it's a ruin. The town's been trying to get rid of it for years. Sterling, the developer, he's got plans for that whole ridge, condos, glass and steel. There's nothing there for you." He saw a liability, a pile of bricks. He did not see the place where her grandfather had gone to work every day for 40 years, the place whose chalk-dusted scent still clung to his clothes when he came home, the place whose name was the last one he had spoken in a clear voice. And so when the notice went up in the post office, a stark black and white announcement of a public auction for the condemned property, it felt less like an opportunity and more like a final whispered instruction. She was to take an interest, and so she would. He was a man who believed a thing well made holds a piece of the maker. It was his only aphorism, the closest he ever came to a philosophy, and he repeated it not with the weight of scripture, but with the simple certainty of a craftsman stating a fact. A wobbly chair was not just a wobbly chair, it was a promise broken. A smooth, sanded finish was not just a surface, it was a show of respect. Ilara had learned this not through lectures, but through osmosis. Standing in the small garage workshop behind his house, the air thick with the sweet, sharp scent of pine and the metallic tang of oil, he had taught her how to hold a hammer, not by the neck in a choked, fearful grip, but at the end of its handle, to let the tool do the work. He had shown her how to read the grain in a piece of lumber, to see the story of the tree's life in its whorls and lines, to know where it would be strong and where it might split. He never praised her work directly. Instead, he would pick up a small box she had made, its dovetailed joints a little uneven, and run his calloused thumb over the seam. "You listen to the wood," he would say, and it was more than enough. He was the school's janitor, a title he held with a quiet, uncomplaining dignity. To the children who streamed past him in the halls, he was a fixture, a part of the building itself, the man with the slow smile and the keys that jangled at his belt. To the teachers, he was the one who fixed the rattling window, who mended the broken leg of a desk, who appeared with a bucket and mop before anyone even had to ask. But his real work, his true calling, happened in the hours after the last bell had rung, when the schoolhouse settled into a deep, breathing silence. The hardware store owner, a woman named Mary, whose face was a road map of every dry summer and hard winter the town had ever known, remembered it well. "Your grandfather," she told Ilara, leaning on a counter stacked with seed packets and boxes of nails, "he bought more linseed oil and fine grit sandpaper than any 5 carpenters combined. He'd come in here, after his shift, smelling of floor wax and chalk, and he'd just nod at the shelf. Never said much, but I knew. He was always mending, always making." Mary saw the town not as a collection of houses, but as a web of small, unseen debts and kindnesses. "People thought he was just a simple man," she continued, wiping her hands on her apron. "But simple is not the same as small. He fixed my porch steps one year. A storm had torn them loose. I came out one morning, and there they were, solid as the day they were built. He never sent a bill, never even mentioned it. When I tried to thank him, he just shrugged and said, 'The nails needed a home.' That was the man they had buried, a man whose kindness was as quiet and sturdy as the things he built. He left behind not a legacy of wealth or property, but 100 small, solid repairs, a network of things made right that held the community together in ways it never even knew. He had never owned the schoolhouse, but in a way, it had belonged to him. He was its keeper, its caretaker, its quiet, constant friend. He tended to its groaning pipes and drafty sills, as a gardener tends to a beloved, aging tree. And when Ilara thought of the building now, condemned and waiting for the wrecking ball, she felt a pang of disloyalty, as if she were standing by while a part of him was being erased. His aphorism echoed in her mind. "A thing well made holds a piece of the maker." The schoolhouse was not well made anymore. It was collapsing. But she knew with a certainty that had no logic to it, that a piece of him was still in there, waiting. The developer's name was Sterling, and it suited him. His hair was silver, his watch was silver, and his smile had the cold, polished gleam of something that could be bought and sold. He saw the town not as a home, but as a portfolio. The old schoolhouse sat on a ridge, with a view, and a view was a commodity. His plans, displayed on a glossy board at the back of the town hall, showed a row of sleek, identical condominiums with glass balconies that would reflect the sky and ignore the town below. The schoolhouse was a smudge on his blueprint, an obstacle to be removed. He had the ear of the town council, or at least the ear of its most influential member, a man named Henderson who spoke of progress and tax revenues in a voice that was perpetually tired. Henderson was the one who had pushed for the condemnation, who had argued that the cost of repairs was prohibitive, that the building was a hazard, an eyesore, an anchor holding them back from a brighter, more profitable future. He was not a cruel man, but a weak one, and he had bent to the pressure of Sterling's money and a town's slow, creeping anxiety about being left behind. Alara's uncle, it turned out, was Sterling's local real estate agent. He was the one who had brokered the deals for the surrounding plots of land, who had smoothed the way with zoning permits and feasibility studies. When Alara told him she was going to the auction, he had rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture of deep, familial weariness. "Don't, Lara," he'd said. "It's a fool's errand. Sterling will get it. It's already been decided. You'll just be embarrassing yourself." But whose embarrassment was he truly worried about? The auction was held on the courthouse steps, a perfunctory affair on a Tuesday morning. A few townspeople stood watching, more out of habit than interest. Sterling was there, standing slightly apart, his arms crossed, radiating an aura of impatient ownership. Henderson, the councilman, read the legal description of the property in a monotone drone, the words stripped of all history, all meaning. Lot 12, Miller's Ridge, 1 brick structure, condition Ausis, opening bid, $10. The amount was a formality, a legal necessity. It was meant to be the only bid. Sterling raised a single, manicured finger, 10. The auctioneer, a man who usually sold livestock and farm equipment, looked around, his gaze sliding past Alara as if she weren't there. "Do I hear 12? His voice was flat. It was a question he didn't expect an answer to. Alara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She held her breath and raised her hand. 12. A ripple of surprise went through the small crowd. A few people turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of pity and confusion. Sterling's polished smile tightened at the edges. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw nothing. A young woman in a worn coat, her face pale with grief and something he mistook for naivete. He saw the janitor's granddaughter, a sentimental fool. He did not see the quiet resolve she had inherited, the stubbornness that came from watching a man spend an entire afternoon perfecting a single joint. Henderson shifted his weight, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Annoyance? Or was it something else? Sterling gave a small, condescending laugh, a puff of air. "Let her have it," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let the girl have her souvenir." He turned and walked away before the gavel even fell, already moving on to his next calculation, his next acquisition. The sound of the hammer striking the wood was small and final. "Sold," the auctioneer said, his voice laced with disbelief. "To the young lady, for $12. Alara walked forward and paid with the last of her cash, a $10 bill and 2 singles. Their creases softened with wear. Henderson handed her the key and the deed, his hand brushing hers. His skin was cold. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "The demolition order stands," he said, his voice low. "You understand that? You're just buying yourself a little time. A month, maybe." She did not reply. She just took the key. A single piece of rusted iron heavy in her palm. It felt less like a key and more like a burden. A promise she didn't yet know how to keep. The schoolhouse sagged. It was the first thing she noticed. Not a dramatic, cinematic collapse, but a deep, weary settling into the earth, as if the building had simply given up. The ridge of the roof was swayed, a tired spine. Bricks were missing from the corners like lost teeth, and the windows were boarded over with weathered plywood, giving it the blind, vacant stare of a skull. A chain-link fence, rusted and bent, surrounded the property, with a single gate held shut by a thick, greasy chain and a padlock. Her key did not fit this lock. It was for the front door, a door she couldn't even reach yet. The developer had put up the fence, a gesture of presumptive ownership, a cage for a ghost he intended to slay. She bought a pair of bolt cutters from Mary at the hardware store, the tool heavy and awkward in her hands. Mary had watched her choose them, her gaze sharp. "Fence?" she'd asked. Alara had just nodded. Mary had nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of the coming fight. "Your grandfather taught you how to use your hands," she said. "It wasn't a question. Don't forget that." The chain parted with a satisfying metallic snap. The gate groaned open on hinges that hadn't moved in years. The air inside the fence was different, still and thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The grass was knee-high, tangled with weeds and wildflowers that had taken root in the ruins of the old playground. A single swing, its seat long gone, hung from a rusted chain, swaying slightly in the breeze, a metronome counting out the slow seconds of neglect. And then she saw him. Buster, her grandfather's dog, a gray-muzzled shepherd mix with eyes the color of old amber. He was supposed to be at the house, but he had a habit of slipping his collar, of vanishing for hours on end. Now she knew where he went. He was lying on the stone steps leading up to the front door, his head on his paws, as if he were on watch. He lifted his head when he saw her, his tail giving a slow, tentative thump-thump against the stone. He didn't bark. He just watched her approach, his gaze steady, a silent, loyal witness to her trespass. She sat on the steps beside him, and he leaned his heavy weight against her leg, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. The key, the old iron key, felt cold in her hand. It slid into the lock of the great wooden door with a grating sound. It took both her hands and all her weight to turn it. The lock, stiff with a decade of disuse, finally gave way with a loud, echoing clunk that seemed to travel through the entire building. The door swung inward on a long, single complaint of a hinge, opening a slice of profound and absolute darkness, and from that darkness flowed a smell that was more than just decay. It was the scent of her childhood, the scent of her grandfather. Under the sharp green smell of mold and the musty odor of wet plaster, there was something else, something deeper. The faint, ghostly perfume of chalk dust, the astringent tang of floor polish, and the warm, resinous scent of old, dry wood. It was the smell of a promise. "Das Gespis." She took a step inside, Buster pressing close to her side, and the door swung shut behind them, plunging them into a dim, dusty twilight. For a long moment they just stood there, letting their eyes adjust, breathing in the forgotten air. Buster, however, seemed to know exactly where he was going. He trotted away from her, his nails clicking softly on the grimy linoleum, and disappeared down a long, dark hallway. A moment later, she heard it. A low, mournful whine coming from the far end of the building. He was calling to her. He had something to show her. The gymnasium was a cavern of lost echoes. The last of the afternoon, light struggled through the high, grime-caked windows, illuminating a world of dust motes dancing in slanted golden bars. The floorboards were warped and buckled in places, a miniature mountain range of water damage. The basketball hoops were still there, their nets rotted away to a few pathetic strings. The air was cold, colder than the rest of the building, and it carried the specific, hollow acoustic of a large, empty room. This was where Buster had led her. He was standing in the center of the vast space, but he wasn't looking at the decaying bleachers or the peeling paint on the walls. He was staring at one wall in particular, the far wall, beneath the basket on the east end of the court. It was a long, unbroken expanse of pale gray cinder blocks, completely blank. No windows, no doors, no vents, just a flat, featureless surface that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The dog whined again, a low, insistent sound from deep in his chest. He took a few steps toward the wall, then looked back at her, his amber eyes filled with a strange, urgent plea. He walked to the wall and pressed his nose against it, sniffing along the mortar lines. Ilara crossed the dusty floor, her footsteps loud in the silence. As she got closer, she saw that the wall was different. The rest of the gymnasium was built of old, dark red brick, the kind that had been laid a century ago. This wall was newer. The cinder blocks were a different color, a different texture. The mortar was paler, cleaner. It was an addition or a repair. A massive one. She remembered Mary's words. He spent his last few years shoring up that gym wall, she'd said. Said it was unsound, the town wouldn't pay for it, so he did it himself. Scrounged the materials. Everyone had thought he was just patching a crumbling foundation, a final, futile act of maintenance on a building everyone else had already abandoned. They saw a janitor doing his job. They didn't see a man building a vault. She ran her hand over the rough surface of the blocks. They were cold and solid. She knocked on it with her knuckles. A dull, solid thud. Nothing. Buster whined again and nudged his head against a spot near the floor, to the left of the center. She knelt down, her knees cracking in the cold. She knocked again right where he had indicated, and this time, the sound was different. Not a dull thud, but a tight, resonant boom. It was hollow. She pressed her ear to the wall, the cold of it seeping into her skin. She held her breath and listened. There was nothing. Just the sound of her own blood roaring in her ears and the vast, dead silence of a sealed space. She stood up and walked the length of the wall, tapping, listening. For 20 feet the sound was solid. Then, for a section about 10 feet wide, it was hollow. A room. A hidden room. Why? Why would her grandfather build a wall to hide an empty space? It made no sense. She went back to the first hollow spot and examined the mortar lines more closely. They were clean, precise, the work of a careful hand. And then she saw it, a single, tiny imperfection. A seam in the mortar, no wider than a hairline, that didn't quite match the others. It was a straight, vertical line, running from the floor to a height of about 6 feet. The outline of a door that had been bricked over. Her hand went to her pocket, to the small wooden block he had left her. She pulled it out. It was a child's building block, sanded smooth, but one corner had been cut into a precise, angular notch. A key. She knelt again, her heart hammering. She held the block up to the wall, her hand trembling slightly. The notch was not random. It was a perfect match, a negative image of a small, almost invisible irregularity in the cinder block right beside the hidden seam. It was a marker, a signpost left only for someone who knew what to look for, someone who had the key. The work was slow and brutal. She returned the next morning with a hammer and a cold chisel from his old toolbox. The tools felt right in her hands, their wooden handles worn smooth and dark, with his sweat and patience. She set the point of the chisel into the mortar seam, had marked for her, and struck it with the hammer. The sound was sharp and loud, an affront to the deep silence of the school. A small puff of gray dust, a tiny chip of mortar falling to the floor. It was a beginning. For hours she worked, her arm aching, her knuckles raw. Chip by chip, crack by crack, she traced the outline of the hidden door. The sun climbed higher, its weak light moving across the dusty floor, and still she worked. Buster lay a few feet away, watching her, his head on his paws, a silent, encouraging presence. The first cinder block came loose with a groan of protest and a shower of debris. It was heavy, heavier than she expected, and she grunted with the effort of pulling it free and setting it on the floor. Behind it was not daylight, not insulation, but only a deeper, more profound darkness. The air that puffed out was not the damp, musty air of the gym, but something else entirely. It was dry and cool, and it carried a scent she knew better than any other. The clean, sharp, resinous perfume of aged pine and cedarwood, the smell of his workshop, the smell of his hands. Hope, fierce and sudden, surged through her. She worked faster now with a renewed strength, her movements sure and certain. The hammer fell in a steady, rhythmic beat. Block after block came loose, until she had created an opening large enough to crawl through. She stopped, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her face streaked with sweat and grime. She peered into the darkness, but could see nothing. She retrieved a flashlight from her back, its beam cutting a bright, wavering circle in the blackness. She aimed it through the hole. The beam did not hit another wall a few feet away. It traveled into a vast, deep space, catching on rows and rows of shapes, stacked neatly, covered in white dust cloths like sleeping ghosts. It was a room. A huge room. It was not empty. She pulled away the last few blocks at the bottom of the opening, and without a moment's hesitation, crawled through, flashlight in hand. She stood up inside and swept the beam of light across the space, and she forgot how to breathe. It was not a storage room. It was a sanctuary. Lined up in perfect military rows were dozens upon dozens of small child-sized desks, their wooden tops glowing a warm honeyed gold in the flashlight's beam. Each one was different, the grain of the wood unique, the slight variations in size and shape speaking to the individual pieces of lumber from which they were born. Beside them were stacks of small chairs, their backs carved with simple, charming shapes, an apple, a star, a crescent moon, and beyond them, on shelves that lined the entire back wall, was an army of wooden toys. Cars with wheels that turned, animals with jointed legs that could be made to walk, rocking horses with manes of real rope, and stacks of brightly painted building blocks. It was a lifetime of work, a forest of wood, transformed by a single pair of hands into a hidden kingdom for children. Everything was covered in a fine layer of sawdust, a testament to the work that had happened right here, in this secret place. In the corner stood a workbench, his workbench, instantly recognizable. The surface was scarred with the marks of saws and chisels, and a single bare bulb hung over it on a cord. His tools were there, laid out neatly, as if he had just stepped away for a moment. A half-finished wooden bird sat on the bench, its wings still rough and uncarved, and next to it, placed squarely in the center, was a large, leather-bound book, a ledger. She walked toward it, her feet silent on the dusty concrete floor. The scale of it was overwhelming. The sheer number of hours, the patience, the love that had been poured into this hidden room was staggering. This was his heart. This was his soul. This was the peace of the Maker, held safe in the dark. The smell that hit her was not of dust and decay, but of cedar and patience. It was the smell of a promise kept in the dark, the scent of wood that had been waiting for a generation to be seen again. Tata. It was the smell of her grandfather's life, the one he had lived when no one was watching. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. It is the part where the quiet man's work finally comes into the light, and the world that dismissed him is forced to reckon with the true measure of his worth. Alara stood in the center of the hidden workshop, the flashlight beam playing over the silent waiting army of desks and toys, and felt a profound sense of trespass, as if she had stumbled into a sacred place. She ran her hand over the surface of the nearest desk. It was perfectly smooth, the finish like satin beneath her calloused fingertips. On the underside, so small she almost missed it, a date and a set of initials had been burned into the wood. Her grandfather's initials. She checked another desk and another. They all had them, a silent signature on a secret gift. She walked to the workbench and picked up the ledger. The leather was cracked with age, but the book was heavy and solid. She opened it to the first page. In her grandfather's neat, careful hand, a hand more accustomed to holding a saw than a pen, was a date from nearly 40 years ago. An entry read, "One desk for the boy in the third row with the broken one, Pine." Page after page was filled with the same simple, meticulous records. 2 chairs for the first grade reading corner, oak set of blocks for the kindergarten class, maple and walnut. And next to some entries, a name. A new top for Sarah M's desk. She likes to draw horses. Carve one on the leg for her, Sarah M. Sarah Miller, she was the town's mayor now. Alara remembered her grandfather coming home one evening, his hands smelling of wood stain, and telling a quiet story about a little girl who loved to draw but whose desk was so splintered She kept getting slivers in her arms. He had shaken his head. "A child needs a smooth place to make her mark," he had said. He had not said he had fixed it. He had not said he had spent a week of his own time with his own materials. Building her a new one, he had just done it. And he had recorded it here, in his secret book. A knock on the outer gymnasium wall, loud and sharp, made her jump. Buster, who had followed her into the hidden room, let out a low growl. "Hello!" a voice called out, muffled by the cinder blocks. "Anyone in there? This is private property." It was Sterling. She clicked off her flashlight, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. She stood frozen, her heart pounding. She heard the scrape of his expensive shoes on the dusty gym floor. He was walking around inspecting the ruin he had purchased, or so he thought. "Henderson said the janitor's girl bought the place," he called out, his voice dripping with amusement. "Look, if you're in here, come on out. I'll give you $1,000 for your trouble, and you can walk away clean. That's 100 times what you paid a good deal. Right, $1,000. For this, for a lifetime of love and labor, for the soul of a good man sitting here in the dark." The rage that filled her was cold and quiet and pure. It sharpened her senses, cleared her head. She did not answer. She stood in the darkness, guarding the secret, and waited for him to leave. After a few more minutes of calling and walking around, he gave up. She heard his footsteps retreat, the groan of the main door opening and closing. Then, silence. But she knew he would be back. She looked down at the ledger in her hands. This was not just a record. It was evidence. It was a testament. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would not sell. She would not walk away. This place, this work, was not for sale. Not for $1,000. Not for anything. A new sound reached her, the rumble of a heavy engine outside. She crept to the opening she had made in the wall and peered out. A large flatbed truck was backing up to the fence. On its bed was a small bulldozer, and taped to the chain-link gate was a new sign, bright orange and stark. Demolition scheduled. 30 days. The clock was ticking. She spent the next days in a fever of discovery, reading the ledger by the light of a battery-powered lantern, cross-referencing the silent rows of furniture with the names and dates her grandfather had so carefully recorded. The ledger told a story the town had never known, a secret history of quiet generosity. For over 30 years, as the school board's budget was cut again and again, as the old furniture splintered and broke, as the town's prosperity faded, her grandfather had waged a one-man war against decay. He had taken it upon himself to replace what was broken, to mend what was worn, to ensure that the children of this town, his town, had good, solid, beautiful things. He used scrap wood, lumber donated from the mill when it was still running, pieces salvaged from torn-down barns. He worked with what he had, and he turned it into treasure. Tucked into the back of the ledger, in a sealed envelope yellowed with age, was a letter. The paper was thin and brittle, and on the front, in his familiar script, were 3 words, "To whoever finds this." Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The letter was not long, but every word carried the weight of a life's conviction. "If you are reading this," it began, "then the wall has held, and I am gone. I am not a man for many words, but some things need to be said. A school is not just a building. It is a place where things begin. A child deserves a good, strong desk to lean on. A place to write their first words, to draw their first pictures. A place that feels solid under their hands. When I saw the first desk break, the one with the cracked leg that the board said they couldn't afford to fix, I knew I couldn't let it stand. So I fixed it. Then another broke. And another. I started building new ones. I couldn't bear to see the old ones thrown out, so I started keeping them too, mending them. This place became my workshop, my secret. The children were my customers, though they never knew it. They paid me in scuffed shoes and laughter in the halls. It was a good bargain. He wrote about the condemnation of the school, the final padlock on the door. He knew what would happen. The building would be sold for scrap, its contents thrown into a landfill. The thought of his desks, his chairs, his toys, the work of his hands and his heart being smashed and burned was more than he could bear. A thing well made holds a piece of the maker. He wrote the familiar words now imbued with a new profound meaning. I have put the best piece of myself into these things. I could not let them be destroyed, so I built a wall. I am not a rich man, I have no money to leave, no land. But this work, this is my estate. It is all I have to give. If you are the one who found it, then you are the one who was meant to. You have good hands. I know you do. Don't let them throw us away. The letter was signed simply, Your grandfather. Alara folded the letter, her vision blurred with tears. It was not a plea. It was a charge, a transfer of duty. He had passed the torch to her, a small, steady flame he had kept alive in the darkness for 30 years. She looked around the vast, silent room, at the legacy he had hidden from the world. It was not an inheritance of money, which could be spent and lost. It was an inheritance of purpose. She now knew what she had to do. The next day, Sterling returned. He found her not in the gym, but standing on the front steps waiting for him. She was holding a single, small, wooden chair, one of the first ones he had made, its back carved in the shape of a simple, 5-pointed star. My offer is off the table, he said, his voice flat and cold. The demolition crew is scheduled. You have 28 days to remove any personal effects. After that, anything left on the property is forfeit. This isn't just a building, she said, her voice quiet but steady. It's a historical record, he laughed. A short, ugly bark. A record of what? Neglect. Decay. This place is a pile of bricks. My grandfather was the janitor here for 40 years, she said, holding the small chair a little tighter. He built things for the children. Sterling's eyes flickered to the chair. He saw a piece of old, worthless furniture. He didn't see the hours of sanding, the careful joinery, the love. Sentimental value doesn't pay taxes, sweetheart, he said, turning to leave. 28 days. She watched him go, his expensive car kicking up a cloud of dust as he drove away. He was a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. He saw a derelict property. She saw a vault filled with treasure. And she would not let him break it open. The town hall meeting was called to finalize the demolition permit. The room was stuffy, smelling of old coffee and civic duty, filled with the usual attendees, a few concerned citizens, a handful of reporters from the local paper, and the town council, looking bored and resigned. Sterling was there, of course, sitting in the front row with his lawyer, a portfolio of glossy architectural renderings on his lap. He looked confident, relaxed, a man on the verge of closing a profitable deal. He nodded politely to the council members, his smile as smooth and empty as his planned condominiums. Alara arrived just as the meeting was called to order. She wasn't alone. Mary from the hardware store was with her, her arms crossed, her expression grim. And behind them, wheeling a handcart, was the councilman Henderson. He was not in his usual suit and tie, but in jeans and a work shirt, his face pale and set. On the handcart, covered by a simple canvas drop cloth, was an object. They moved to the side of the room, waiting. The meeting began. Sterling's lawyer gave a slick presentation about progress, about growth, about the economic benefits of the new development. He spoke of property values and modern amenities. He referred to the schoolhouse as the blighted property and a public hazard. When he finished, the head of the council cleared his throat. We have the demolition order here, ready for a final vote. Is there any last public comment? This was her moment. Alara walked to the front of the room. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, curious, skeptical, pitying. Sterling watched her with a look of mild amusement. My name is Alara, she said, her voice shaking only slightly. My grandfather was the janitor at the old Miller's Ridge School. A few people in the audience murmured, a flicker of recognition. She turned to Henderson, who wheeled the handcart to the center of the room and pulled off the drop cloth. Underneath was a single, perfect child-sized desk. The wood glowed under the harsh fluorescent lights. On the leg, so small it was almost a secret, was a carving of a galloping horse. Alara held up the ledger. My grandfather kept a record of his work, she said. She opened it. He wasn't just a janitor, he was a craftsman. When the school's furniture broke, and the town had no money to replace it, he built new ones. In secret, for 30 years, she ran her finger down a page. The 12th of October, 1988, she read. A new top for Sarah M.'s desk. She likes to draw horses, carved one on the leg for her. A gasp went through the room. At the council table, the mayor, Sarah Miller, a woman in her late 40s, stared at the desk, her face ashen. She slowly stood up and walked toward it as if in a trance. She reached out and traced the outline of the small carved horse. My desk, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I remember this. I had a splintered old desk, and one Monday, this was just there. I thought it was magic. Ilara continued reading. May 3rd, 1992. 2 chairs for the first-grade reading corner. Oak for Mr. Henderson's class. At the side of the room, Henderson visibly flinched. He had been a first-grade teacher before he went into politics. January 1995, a set of blocks for the kindergarten. For Mrs. Gable's class, because the plastic ones were all cracked. A woman in the 3rd row, Mrs. Gable, now retired and gray-haired, put a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. One by one, Ilara read the names, the dates, the small, specific acts of kindness. A wave of recognition, of shared memory, washed through the room. These were not just objects. They were pieces of their childhood, gifts they had never known they had received. The room was silent, save for the sound of Ilara's voice and the quiet, dawning comprehension on the faces of the people who had grown up within those walls. Sterling's polished smile was gone, replaced by a look of disbelief, then fury. This was not on his blueprint. This was a variable he had not calculated. The narrative had been snatched from him. He was no longer the bringer of progress. He was the man who wanted to bulldoze a town's collective memory. Councilman Henderson stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly. He cleared his throat, and the room, which had fallen into a stunned, emotional silence, turned its attention to him. I was a teacher there, he began, his voice raspy. I remember those chairs. They just appeared one day. They were better than the old ones, solid. We all just assumed the district had found some money somewhere. We never asked. We never thought to ask who had made them. He looked from the desk to Ilara, and then his gaze fell upon the mare, who was still standing by the small piece of her childhood, her hand resting on the carved horse. When Mr. Sterling came to us, Henderson continued, his voice gaining strength, he talked about progress, about the future. And I was so focused on that. I forgot to look at the past. I knew her grandfather. He was a quiet man. He was always tinkering, always fixing things. I saw him shoring up that gymnasium wall, and I thought he was a fool, wasting his time on a building that was already gone. I signed the condemnation order. I pushed for the sale. He paused and took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked directly at Sterling, his eyes filled, not with defiance, but with a deep, profound shame. I was wrong. This building isn't a hazard. It's a treasure chest. And we were about to hand the key over to a man who would have melted it down for scrap. The mayor, Sarah Miller, finally looked up. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was firm. This meeting is adjourned, she announced. The demolition order for the Miller's Ridge Schoolhouse is hereby suspended, pending a full historical and structural review. Sterling shot to his feet, his face crimson. You can't do that. I have a contract. I bought the land. You bought a building, the mayor countered, her voice ringing with newfound authority. And it seems there is far more to this building than any of us knew. The sale was predicated on the property being derelict and of no historical value. This new evidence suggests that premise was flawed. We will see you in court, Mr. Sterling. Sterling stood there for a moment, sputtering, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. But the tide in the room had turned. He was no longer a developer, he was a villain. The townspeople were looking at him with open hostility. He had underestimated them. He had underestimated the quiet janitor, and he had underestimated the girl in the worn coat. He gathered his glossy renderings and stormed out of the town hall, the door slamming shut behind him. The sound did not echo. It was swallowed by the sudden excited buzz of conversation that erupted in the room. People crowded around Ilara, around the desk, touching the wood, sharing stories, remembering. I had a chair with a star on it. He fixed my locker latch a dozen times. He always had a piece of candy in his pocket. A history that had been silent was finally being spoken aloud. The next morning, Ilara was at the schoolhouse when a dusty pickup truck pulled up. Henderson got out. He was not wearing a suit. He was wearing work boots and carrying a pair of leather gloves. He didn't say much. He just looked at the crumbling facade of the building, and then at her. "Where do we start?" he asked. It was his first act of penance, the beginning of a long and quiet apology. He had helped to break it. Now, he would help to mend it. Sterling's legal challenges crumbled under the weight of public opinion and the mayor's newfound resolve. The town, awakened to the treasure it had almost discarded, rallied around the schoolhouse. The story ran in the local paper, then was picked up by a regional news station. People who had moved away years ago read about it online and sent small donations. The community chorus had arrived. A retired contractor showed up one morning and offered to inspect the building's structure for free. A team of librarians from the county seat volunteered to help catalog the contents of the hidden workshop. The high school history club asked to make a documentary. Every day, someone new would arrive at the schoolhouse, not with pity, but with an offer of help. A thermos of hot coffee, a box of donuts, an hour of their time sweeping floors or clearing brush. Henderson was there every day, working quietly and tirelessly, his movements driven by a need to repay a debt that could never truly be settled. He scraped old paint, reglazed windows, and listened as Ilara told him stories about her grandfather. He was learning the true meaning of value, not in dollars and cents, but in sawdust and patience. Ilara decided not to sell the collection. It didn't belong to a museum, locked behind glass. It belonged to the town. With the community's help, they began the slow, careful process of restoring the schoolhouse. The plan was to turn the main building into a community center and a public workshop, a place where the next generation could learn to use their hands, to feel the satisfaction of making something solid and true. The hidden room would be preserved just as her grandfather had left it, a small, quiet museum dedicated to a man who had sought no credit and had left behind a legacy of anonymous love. Her uncle came to see her one afternoon. He stood awkwardly in the doorway of the bustling schoolhouse, watching a group of volunteers patch the plaster in the main hall. He looked smaller than she remembered, his certainty replaced by a quiet humility. "I was wrong, Ilara," he said, his voice low. "I saw a worthless building. I didn't see him. I never really saw him." She didn't offer easy forgiveness. She just nodded. "He was easy to miss," she said. It was the truth. He had made himself small so that his work could be big. Her uncle looked around at the restored desks being carefully carried into a classroom, at the sound of hammers and the smell of fresh paint. "He would have liked this," he said. And then he left, leaving behind an envelope on a windowsill. Inside was a check, a portion of his commission from the Sterling deals. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. Family, Ilara was learning, was not about who shared your blood. It was about who showed up. It was Mary from the hardware store who dropped off a box of new screws every week. It was Henderson, who now knew the name of every child her grandfather had built a desk for. It was the retired contractor and the volunteer librarians and the teenagers from the history club. They were her family now, a family built on a shared purpose, bound together by the legacy of a quiet man and the things he had made. The work was long and hard, but she was not alone. Grief, she found, had not disappeared. It had simply changed its shape. The sharp, cutting ache of loss had been transformed into the steady, warm weight of purpose. She was no longer just the janitor's granddaughter. She was his heir, and the inheritance was not a burden, but a gift, a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to build. Spring came fully to Miller's Ridge, a soft green wave that washed over the hills and filled the air with the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. The schoolhouse no longer sagged. It stood straighter, its new windows gleaming in the sun, a fresh coat of paint on its old wooden doors. The sound of children's laughter had not yet returned to its halls, but the sound of work and community had, which was a kind of life just as vital. One Saturday afternoon, as Alara was in the workshop, carefully sanding the wing of the small wooden bird her grandfather had left unfinished, a young family she didn't recognize paused by the open doors. They were new to town, their car still packed with boxes, their faces etched with the weary anxiety of a new start. A small girl, no older than 6, with wide, curious eyes, peered into the workshop, her gaze falling upon the shelves of wooden toys. Her parents tried to pull her along, murmuring apologies, but the child was captivated, her small hand pointing at a carved wooden horse. Elora watched them for a moment, seeing in their worn clothes and hopeful faces a familiar story. She remembered what her grandfather had written. A school is not just a building, it is a place where things begin. She wiped the sawdust from her hands onto her jeans and walked over to the workbench. She picked up the small, half-finished bird. It felt light and full of promise in her hand. With a few deft strokes of a small carving knife, she finished shaping the wings, giving them a gentle upward curve. She sanded them smooth, the movements coming to her as naturally as breathing. The wood grew warm under her fingers. She walked outside, down the stone steps where Buster had once kept his lonely vigil. She knelt down so she was at eye level with the little girl. "Hello," she said softly. The girl hid behind her mother's legs, peeking out shyly. Alara held out the small wooden bird. "I think this is for you," she said. The child's eyes grew wide. She reached out a tentative hand and took the bird, her small fingers closing around its smooth, warm body. She looked from the bird to Alara, and a slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. Her parents started to protest to say they couldn't pay, but Alara just shook her head. "It's a gift," she said. "Welcome to town." She watched them walk away, the little girl holding the bird up to the sky, making it fly through the bright spring air. Alara turned and looked back at the schoolhouse, at the open doors of the workshop, at the rows of beautiful, patient work waiting inside. She finally understood the full truth of it, the simple, profound equation of his life. A thing well made holds a piece of the maker. The legacy was not in the objects themselves, it was in the act of giving them away. It was alive. Her hands, covered in a fine, pale dust, felt for a fresh piece of wood. It was time to begin again.
Is Switch 2 gonna be able to play old Switch games? Oh yeah, for sure, Ash Money. They actually just put out an update where, and honestly, it should have been like this from the beginning, but they put out an update to where old Switch games are now better optimized and run better than they did on the original Switch. Did you see the Pokemon Champions trailer? I did, Robbie. It was pretty interesting, for sure. Okay, we'll put that in there. It's like, do we have any extra wooden pillars? Yeah, okay. Oops. Would you play it, or is it pay to win type game? It's kind of pay to win, Robbie. If it hadn't been, I totally wouldn't have played it. But apparently it's a like pretty pay to win. Like the amount of currency that you need that you can get by not paying is like just straight up not enough to be sustainable. Like if you want like all of the things, you essentially need to pay to win, which is really disappointing. I was hoping that it was going to be like the old school Pokemon Coliseums, but apparently it's nothing like that. You know, maybe instead of down, we go up. Yeah, and the recruitment Pokemon process seems too slow. Yeah, that's what I saw too. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't know if I'm gonna play it. I have so many other games to play that aren't pay to win that like I'm just not gonna waste my time on that, to be honest. Oh, thanks for the roses, Ash. Appreciate it.